Is D&D 5e too easy? Are your optimized builds plowing through encounters unless your DM blasts the roof off the encounter difficulty? What if, instead of having the DM crank up the difficulty on the encounters, we crank up the difficulty on our builds? Some people will purposefully sabotage their character's stats, something like making their dump stat their primary ability.
Oh no!
I think this usually ends up creating a frustrating character, either frustrating for the player or for the party because they end up useless. Instead, what I'd like to do is impose a mechanical limitation on our character, and then we can optimize and build our best around this limitation to attempt to overcome it. Another really cool benefit of this is it kind of builds in an automatic character arc, or it solidifies our character's personality in-game, in the mechanics themselves and how we play them. And for me, that could be really fun. Today, the handicap I want to give our character is that the only action they can take in combat is ready action. This means they never take the action on their turn, they always have to take it on other people's turns. Roleplay wise, maybe we have anxiety and we can't make up our mind until the very last second. Or we have magic that's inside of us that we don't know how to push out. It only comes when danger strikes, and at the very last moment we're able to pull it out and save somebody. Whatever the reason is, let's dive into this and see what we can make and how we can design this character to be really fun and powerful. Since we'll be readying our action each turn, let's take a quick peek at the rules to see how this works and what limitations will apply. The way it works is that on our turn, we delay our action. We specify a trigger for when this action is going to happen. We can say, for example, when the goblin walks over the trapdoor, I pull the lever. If the trigger never occurs, then our action is wasted. If the trigger does occur, we can use our reaction to then activate what we said we were going to do. If we're preparing a spell, we cast the spell and hold it until the trigger occurs. This means that the leveled spell restriction for our action and bonus action still applies, because we are casting it on our turn. The spell slot is not used until the trigger occurs. The time between our turn and the trigger, we have to concentrate on this spell. If our concentration is broken, our spell is lost, but the spell slot is not used. For martial characters, we can hold our attack, but extra attack does not apply because extra attack says it's only on your turn. Another caveat is that our movement happens before we ready our action, so we can't move and attack and move like we normally would on our turn. We have to do all our movement first and then ready our action. Whether we're casting spells or we're doing attacks, this can be pretty debilitating. If we don't have extra attack, that's essentially halving our damage. And for a spellcaster, it's putting a lot off the table. We can't concentrate on anything. If we're holding our action to cast a spell each turn, our concentration's broken each turn, so we can't hold on to those big powerful controls or damage spells like we normally can. Also, for both sides, our reactions are pretty much taken up, so opportunity attacks and defensive features like shield, absorb elements, counterspell, these are very difficult to use because we're going to be using our reaction every turn for the ready action. Now, there are a couple builds that I can think of that would actually thrive in this environment. One would be a rogue berserker barbarian, someone that can use sneak attack twice a round because they attack on their turn and they can attack with their readied action. Or potentially, it's a build that's specialized in those spells that only deal a damage once per turn. Something like a Chardalon Stride. We can then use our ready action to move around on someone else's turn. That way we can trigger it twice. These would be fun and useful builds, but I just made a video about calculating crowd control per round. So I feel like I have to go for a control build. And the build I arrived at is really, really different. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. It turns a regular D&D fight into a chess match, where you are maneuvering your pieces and taking into account where the enemies are in order to deny them their actions or prevent them from taking the full effect of their actions. The way we are often going to do this is by preventing our enemies from reaching their target. This could mean slowing them down or moving them far away so that they can't reach the target and they have to use their action to dash, therefore wasting their attacks. We also can eventually use this to our advantage to force the enemies to attack only us, because we remove all the other targets. We can kind of take on a pseudo tanking role. There are only a couple abilities in the game that discourage the enemy from attacking somebody else, or really encourage them to attack us. Things like the Armorer Artificer, or the Cavalier Fighter. These ones can really encourage them to attack us. In this build, we can do that in a different way by removing all the other targets. And that's a pretty interesting idea. It can be an extremely strong leadership or teamwork build, kind of like 4th edition's Warlord. You're maneuvering all the pieces of the battlefield and granting them bonuses and extra attacks and whatever you can do to control the flow of battle. For race, I struggled a lot here. I deliberated between Eladrin and Earth Genasi for a while. Ultimately, either of them will work well, but I think Eladrin's a little bit better. Earth Genasi has such great flavor with this because we end up doing a lot of Earth abilities, so I feel like it can create a really strong Bender type character and go in that flavor super hard. But the additional abilities given to us by the Eladrin are a little hard for me to ignore. The key ability that I want from the Eladrin is obviously their phase step. It's really, really good. They have 4 seasons, and each season can add an additional effect to the phase step. We can change this season out when we rest, but essentially what we want to look at is the winter and the spring. Winter, when we teleport, we can then frighten an enemy, and spring, instead of teleporting ourselves, we can teleport an ally within 5 feet of us. These are going to be super, super useful. So I'm going that way. Now in terms of our classes, at level 1 to 5, we're going to be going Sorcerer and Warlock. Specifically the Clockwork Soul Sorcerer, because they give us great defensive abilities. For our Warlock, we're going to go Fathomless. This is going to give us a cool ability that we can summon a tentacle and use a bonus action to attack people. When we hit them, it deals a little bit of damage, and we also can slow them 10 feet. This is going to be very useful for us. We also are going to get Eldritch Blast and take Repelling Blast. And this will help us keep distance from our enemies as well. So we end up with 3 levels of Sorcerer, 2 levels of Warlock. There are lots of great spells. The ones I'm going to want are going to be Earth Tremor, Grease, Vortex Warp, Levitate, Hideous Laughter, Mind Whip, Shield, Absorb Elements, Armor of Agathis, and Aid. This is a lot of good control spells and defensive spells. Let's take a look at how these are used and how our character is going to function in combat. At early levels, we're not that durable. We're going to want to keep our distance and blast from a range. We're going to do our best to set up a Grease spell as our base of operations to hinder our enemies. Let's take a look at some example scenarios in an encounter. Here we have an enemy and they are 30 feet away from our ally. Here we are down here. On our turn, we can use our bonus action to hit this creature with a tentacle, reducing its speed by 10. If it had a speed of 30, it now has a speed of 20, and it now cannot reach. It then has to use its action to dash and engage in melee. If the tentacle misses, we can prepare our Eldritch Blast, with the trigger being this enemy attacking our ally. When it approaches our ally, they've used up 25 feet of their movement, and we then will launch an Eldritch Blast, hitting them back 10 to 20 feet. The enemy then needs to use their dash action to move forward. Therefore, they've wasted their turn. Another option is that we use our Grease spell. This is probably what we're going to do the first round of each encounter so we can set up our Grease. It becomes an area of difficult terrain, and the enemy is going to have to make a saving throw or fall prone. If they fall prone, there's no way they're going to make it. Even if they don't fall prone, they can't make it to our ally anyway, because they've already used 25 feet of movement. Moving further in the Grease will be 10 feet, and getting out of it and around is going to be more than that. Now this is just the beginning of combat, so things are obviously a little clearer here. Here's another example scenario. Let's say we have a skirmisher on our team, someone like a rogue or a monk. They've hit this enemy and they've run away. What we do is we use our bonus action to tentacle them and slow their speed by 10 feet. They now only can move 20 feet, but everyone on the team is still within range. We then prepare Levitate, the trigger being this enemy attacking. If this enemy decides to go after the skirmisher and attack them, we then activate our Levitate, and this ally immediately floats 15 feet into the air. That creature can no longer attack them, they're not in range. Instead, what they're going to have to do is use the rest of their movement to try to get to somebody else. They only have 10 feet of movement left, so they have to use their dash action to reach anybody else. If, let's say, back on our turn, our tentacle didn't succeed, instead of preparing Levitate, we can prepare something like Mind Whip. If we cast Mind Whip on them, they will either have to use their action or their move. Since nobody is in melee, they have to use their move, and their action is wasted. A good question might be, why not just use Mind Whip anyway? The answer is, if we use our tentacle to slow them and succeed, our Levitate spell will have a 100% chance of denying them their attack, whereas the Mind Whip will only work if they fail their save. I do want to say that it doesn't matter how many enemies there are, as long as we can deny one of the enemies their actions, we've done our job. In this example, both of our allies are engaged in melee. And because there's no distance between the enemies and our allies, we can't use Mind Whip to prevent actions. Instead, we have a couple options. Option number 1. If we hit them with the tentacle, and we Eldritch Blast them through the grease and they fall prone, they then won't be able to reach our allies. This is requiring a lot of things to happen in order for it to line up, but it's not using any resources, so it's an option. Another option would be for us to use our Winter Eladrin Phase Step. If we were to approach the enemy, use our Phase Step to teleport away, we then can inflict the fear condition on this enemy. We then will prepare Eldritch Blast to shoot that enemy away from our allies. If at least one of the Eldritch Blasts hit, it will be knocked back, and it will be unable to approach us or our allies because it's afraid of us and can't move closer. Another option is simply attempt a Hideous Laughter. They will be incapacitated, and we then will deny them their turn. I hope this gives a good idea of how our scenarios can go and what actions we can take to deny enemies their attacks. A couple problems I think that you'll likely have seen. 1, movement speed is pretty important to us. So if we're in combat with an enemy with a high movement speed, this can become even trickier. 2, flying enemies or ranged enemies add a lot of problems here too. Right now, we don't have a lot of great solutions to that. Hideous Laughter is probably the best. Another problem is if we are in melee. We don't have a lot of great options there. All of these weaknesses we'll address as we level up, but let's take a look at level 5 now, what our capabilities are in terms of damage, control, and durability. If we were to use these strategies, we end up hitting with the odd Tentacle and Eldritch Blast. It doesn't do a lot. We're going to be hitting 4 damage per round. That is pretty low. Something I like to do on this channel is calculate something called combat space. Essentially, it gives context to a DPR number. 4 may not sound like a lot, and it isn't. But does 12 sound like a lot? Is 20 good here at level 5? Sometimes it's hard to say. So what we use is we can say how much percent of an encounter does this damage take up. I'll put a link up showing how it's calculated, but right now, 4 damage per round is only going to take out 7.6% of an encounter. Not a lot. In terms of our durability, we're not great either. If we were to sit in the front of combat and take all the hits we can, we would not last long. We would take, on average, 47 damage per round, and we would only last 0.85 rounds if we were to do that. Lastly, I mentioned that I have a way to calculate how much control our character exerts. CPR, control per round, if you will. Essentially, the way it works is we calculate percentages of unconscious. If we have an enemy fully unconscious, we have controlled them. So that would be 100%. The unconscious condition is then broken down into a bunch of subconditions, and each of those are given values for how potent they are in the unconscious condition. We then can calculate how much control we've exerted based on this unconscious condition, and we can calculate portions of it. So if we were to deny somebody their action, that would be 40 points. That is a considerable amount of their control. And it's almost halfway to an unconscious condition if they have no action. I'll then sum up the effects that we deal, and I'll calculate the probability of them happening and multiply those together. Similar to the way we get DPR, we calculate our average damage and then multiply it by our probability to hit. Here, we calculate our control we would exert if we hit, multiplied by the probability of that happening. I'll quickly give an example of the CPR calculations using that tentacle and levitate or mind whip combination we were looking at before. So first, we'll attempt to hit with our tentacle. At this point, we have a 60% chance to hit with the tentacle. That's going to slow them by 10 feet, which is going to be a third of their movement, and that will be 4 control points. Then we use levitate, and that has an 100% chance of removing their action. So that will be another 40 control points. If the tentacle misses, which we have a 40% chance of it missing, we will then use mind whip. Based on the intelligence saving throws at this level, mind whip has a 64% chance of hitting. If this happens, we then have denied them their action again. If we sum these up, we have 36.7 control points for this round. So here, for us at level 5, our CPR is 29. This is not astounding, but considering we can't concentrate on any control spells, it's pretty good. And all these things are going to get much, much better once we hit the next few levels. Let's take a look at levels 6 to 9. We are going to start really branching out in our multiclassing here. Hopefully your DM's okay with that. We're going to take one level of cleric, and we're going to go order cleric here. This is going to give us a really fun ability that when we target an ally with a spell, they can use their reaction to make an attack. It doesn't have to be a melee attack, just an attack. So this works with ranged weapon attacks as well. For us as a sorcerer, we've picked up the Careful Spell Meta Magic. This will let our allies automatically succeed on saving throws. If we have an area of effect spell that targets everybody, we can keep our allies safe and hurt the enemies. Then, our allies have technically been targeted by the spell, so they can use their reaction to make a weapon attack as well. This gets really fun if our allies have the Crusher feat, and I'll show you that in a second. Next, we're going to take a level of Bard, and this is going to give us Dissonant Whispers. This is going to be another really good option for when we're in melee. When it hits, it forces an enemy to use their reaction to move away from us. This means they're moving, it's not forced movement, so anybody that they're passing can take opportunity attacks against them. If there's one enemy and they're surrounded by our guys, we can use Dissonant Whispers. This will get them out of there. All our allies will get attacks on them. It'll be great. The cool part about this is if we have our difficult terrain up, they're not going to be able to make it back to us. Because if they use their reaction to move their full speed away, and they're exiting our difficult terrain, coming back, it will use more movement because they're entering the difficult terrain. So they'll have to use their action to dash to get even further. And this applies regardless of the enemy's movement speed, so that's great for us. Lastly, we're going to take 2 more levels of Sorcerer. This is going to get us access to a feat and some new spells. The feat we're going to take is Telekinetic. If we're moving people all around the board and we're a Chessmaster, then we want to have as many options as we can. Sometimes we can use our bonus action to Tentacle, sometimes we can use our bonus action Telekinesis to move our allies or the enemies, depending on what situation fits best. Lastly, we end up as a level 5 Sorcerer. This gives us level 3 spells, and the one I'm looking at here is Thunderstep. What it does is you can teleport and bring along an ally with you. You also will deal some damage in the area that you just left. So this will really help us get people out of melee and distance ourselves and our team from the enemies. In terms of defenses, we now have access to medium armor, thanks to our cleric dip. Actually heavy armor, but we're not going to go heavy because we want to keep our movement speed and we don't have enough strength. But this boosts our AC quite a lot. We'll have medium armor and a shield, and now we'll have a 17 AC. With these boosts we've just gotten, our tactics change somewhat, but the goal is always the same. Let's take a look at some example scenarios of what we can do now. Let's take a look at this scenario here again. We can do similar things like before, use our Tentacle or Eldritch Blast to keep them away, or Grease. Now though, I'm going to suggest using Earth Tremor. As the enemy approaches, we can use Earth Tremor to potentially knock them prone and to create an area of difficult terrain within 10 feet radius of us. So as they approach our ally, we will then cast Earth Tremor. This then will knock the enemy prone, and we can use our Order Cleric ability to grant our ally one attack against them. This enemy is now prone, so our ally has advantage on this attack. If our ally has the Crusher feat, we then can knock them back another 5 feet. And this area is now all difficult terrain. They can't reach us, even if they weren't knocked prone by this. Crusher here becomes a great combo. In this example, we now have our allies in melee with it, and we can use Dissonant Whispers. If they fail, they have to move 30 feet away from us. This is going to be 10 feet, then 15, 20, 25, 30 feet away. Now with their movement, they also have 30 feet, and they're going to try to get back. So they have 5, 10, 15, 25. They can't reach us. They have to use their action to dash in order to get an extra movement and come back to the space they just were. Not only is Dissonant Whispers granting 2 opportunity attacks, it's also preventing their action. Now let's take a look at this other example. If we are a Spring Eladrin, we can use our bonus action to face step one of our allies instead of ourselves. What we can do is we can face step this ally to the other side. Now he's out of reach of this enemy's movement. We then move over close to our ally here. Now we ready action to do Thunder Step when this enemy is about to attack. On its turn, as it's about to attack, we Thunder Step, teleporting both of us away over with our ally. This enemy will take some damage, and as we teleport over, our ally, who was the target of a spell, will be able to make an attack as a reaction against this enemy over here. Now this enemy has to travel through all this difficult terrain in order to reach us. That's 30 feet of movement right there. So it's unable to reach us without using their dash action. Another option that starts to become more viable here is tanking. Here, in this example, we're surrounded by these enemies. If our ally is not that durable and we want to take some of the hits away from them, what we can do is use our face step bonus action to teleport them away from here, and then we can ready some action that would defend ourselves, something like the dodge action, or we can actually just wait and use the shield spell. We've essentially removed the targets for these enemies to hit, and now we'll take all the damage. Why would we want to do that? For 2 reasons maybe. 1, we have better defenses and we're more likely to soak up that damage. 2, we can put our Armor of Agathys on. Armor of Agathys is a fantastic spell. What it does is it gives you temporary HP, and as long as you have that temp HP up, if an enemy hits you, they will take that amount of damage as well. At this level, we could have a 4th level Armor of Agathys up. That would give us 20 temporary HP, and when one of these enemies hit us, they will take 20 cold damage. If we can do something to reduce that damage, such as using Blade Ward, we then will take half the damage from weapon attacks that are bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing. So our Armor of Agathys temporary hit points will last much longer. So these are some examples of how our new abilities can come into play and cover up some of the weaknesses we had before. If we're fighting ranged enemies, we can poof one of our allies over there using Vortex Warp or Thunder Step, grant them additional free attacks, and to hopefully take them out quickly and reduce that threat. As for flying enemies, unfortunately they're still not affected by our difficult terrain that we can create. So they're resistant to some of these things, or it's more difficult to work around it. But of course, things like Hideous Laughter and Mind Whip still work great. I also wanted to note that in these examples, we're using the spell Earth Tremor. We can use it as a base of operation similar to Grease, and each 5 feet we push them back is equivalent to 10 feet because it's difficult terrain. So our Eldritch Blast pushes can get us a lot farther. Same with our telekinetic pulls, or any of our teleports for that matter. If you want to use Earth Tremor earlier or use Grease here, it doesn't matter. I used Grease earlier so that we can push them through and potentially knock them prone again. This gives a little bit more options when we don't have a lot of spell slots to use. Whereas now, with Earth Tremor, we're able to use a lot more spell slots to maneuver our people around, so the bigger area of difficult terrain becomes more powerful. This is one of the reasons why I thought going Earth Genasi and doing an Earthbender type would be really fun, because Earth Genasi can ignore difficult terrain on ground or natural stone, and so we'd be able to move freely here. And also, a lot of our abilities could just be reflavored as Earthbender abilities. Like Eldritch Blast, that's just shooting a couple stones at them and it pushes them back. Or Levitate, instead of actually magically moving them up, we slam the ground and a pillar of earth blasts them up into the air for just a moment, long enough to avoid some attacks, and then they hit the ground again. Even our teleports, like Vortex Warp, that could just be the earth shifting around under their feet, mixing up the enemies and the allies. So I could totally see an Earthbender take on this, and it could be really fun. So using these strategies and having our Armor of Agathis up, we are able to deal a lot more damage. At level 9, we're dealing 15.5 damage per round on average, if we account for getting hit twice while using Armor of Agathis. This is not a ton, but it's now 19.6% combat space. So that's getting much better. Our control per round has gone up significantly. This is because we have the Order Cleric, which lets us grant extra attacks. Those extra attacks can really stack up, and I haven't included that damage in the DPR calculations. Who knows what those are going to be? It's going to be dependent on your party makeup. Our control per round is now 53.4, so that is half of unconscious. This is actually getting pretty high. Our defenses have gone up quite a bit from our boost to AC, and assuming we're using some spells to cast Aid and Armor of Agathis. If all enemies are targeted all their attacks on us in a deadly encounter, we'll take 57 points of damage per round. And right now, we can take that for 1.6 rounds before we drop. It's not fantastic, but it's okay durability. Now let's keep moving and see what levels 10 to 13 get us in this build. We're going to continue down the path of Bard. We're specifically looking for the Glamour subclass. It gives us a really cool ability called Mantle of Inspiration. Here we can use a bonus action to expend our Bardic Inspiration and choose some allies within our radius to give them temporary HP, and they can use their reaction to move their speed without provoking opportunity attacks. Now, when we're all mixed up, we can use our bonus action to spread the entire party again the way that we want them, so that we can use our abilities to prevent attacks. This is yet another great way for us to manipulate the battlefield, play it as if we're playing a game of chess, maneuvering the pieces where we want, and granting them bonuses and protection. We're also going to take one more level of Sorcerer here, which is going to give us our level 6 Clockwork Soul feature. Essentially, we spend 1 to 5 sorcery points, and for each sorcery point we spend, we get a D8 that we can use to protect our HP. So let's say we spend 5 sorcery points. When we get hit by an attack, we can expend 1 to 5 D8s, roll those, and subtract that number from the amount of damage we took. Now, this is not temporary HP. It will stack on top of our temp HP. So if we have Armor of Agathis up, we then can use this to protect our Armor of Agathis temp HP. So we can get more out of it. So let's say we have an Armor of Agathis, 20 temp HP. They hit us for 10 damage. We can roll some dice and prevent maybe 8 of that damage. Then our temp HP only takes 2 damage, so we have 18 left for our Armor of Agathis. We can then stretch this Armor of Agathis out longer to deal more damage to our enemies. It's going to be great. I think you may have noticed that we're getting a lot of uses for our bonus action. We can use a bonus action to summon a tentacle to slow our enemies. We can use a bonus action to use telekinetic to push or shove or pull enemies or allies. We can also use it as Mantle of Inspiration to allow our allies to move, or we can use it as Phase Step from our Eladrin to teleport ourselves or others or generate the Frightened condition. Normally, I think this would be too many uses for our bonus action, because our bonus action is often the hinge for what we're going to take next. If our bonus action succeeds, or if we can move them this way or that way, but that will determine what action we will ready. So as long as we have lots of options for what to do with that, our options for how we can manipulate the battlefield will increase as well. At this point, maybe our Warlock levels with Eldritch Blast and our Tentacle are going to get used less and less. So if you're starting the campaign later, maybe it would be worth it to skip the Warlock levels and just continue along in Sorcerer. But early on in the game, when we don't have a lot of resources to spend, those Warlock Eldritch Blast, Repelling Blast, and that Tentacle will get us really far. Now let's take a look at level 13, what our damage, control, and durability look like. For our damage, if we have Armor of Agathis up, and we're able to take 3 hits before that temp HP disappears, and I don't think that's quite a stretch, because we have Bastion of Law, which can protect our temp HP. Between that, our Earth Tremor, Eldritch Blast, and our Thunder Steps, we're going to end up with a 29 DPR. And at this level, that's 25% combat space. That's actually quite nice. That's average damage. And that's more than I expected to happen with this control build. For our control, it's increased slightly. Now it's 60 CPR. This is because we have that bardic use of Mantle of Inspiration. And our DCs go up, which increases our effectiveness. So it's more likely that our controls will hit. Lastly, for our durability, we're taking 89 damage per round. And because we have Bastion of Law, we're able to prevent some of that damage. So we'll actually last 1.9 rounds before we fall. Now we're getting close to 2, which is quite a good durability. Now for the last few levels we'll look at in this build, levels 14 to 17, we're going to go 1 level of Bard to get Bard 5, and we'll go the rest Sorcerer. By now, we've finally maxed our Charisma. The feat we get here at Sorcerer 8 can give us a little more freedom in what we choose. We could take the Tough feat to increase our durability, or we could go Warcaster. This could give us boosts to our concentration checks and opportunity attacks with our spells, which right now our opportunity attacks suck, but we're rarely going to use them even if we have good ones, so maybe not a great choice here. The option I took here was the new Cartomancer's feat. This is kind of a tricky one, and there's a lot of discourse on what it actually means and how it works, but here's my interpretation of how it works. If your DM disagrees, maybe this isn't a good feat for you. The main thing we're looking at here is the feature Hidden Ace. Note here it says, you choose a spell from your class's spell list. This means we can choose a spell that's on our class list that we actually can't cast because we're too low of a level in that class. It only has to be a level that we have spell slots for. Right now, we have level 8 spell slots, but we have Cleric 1, Bard 5, Sorcerer 8. This means we can't cast level 8 spells. We can only upcast spells to level 8. But with this feat, we can now cast level 8 spells from any of those spell lists. And that is extremely powerful for us. Gives us access to some of the best spells in the game. And if we continue and eventually hit level 9 spell slots, we'll be able to cast all the best ones. My top pick here would probably be Force Cage. That's on the Bard spell list, so we have access to it. And it doesn't require concentration, so even though we have to ready action and lose concentration, this doesn't affect it. Moving on, we do eventually hit Sorcerer 9, and we get access to 5th level spell slots. And probably Synaptic Static is what I'd choose here. It is a pretty good control spell and allows us to really debuff our enemies in a strong way. Lastly, we're going Bard 5 here, which is going to give us Font of Inspiration. This gives us all of our Bardic Inspirations back on a short rest, and it's fantastic. Now we can use our Bardic Inspiration a lot more. Our tactics haven't changed much. We can now just do everything bigger, better, more often than we could before. And on those special occasions, we can pull out our ultimate cards like Force Cage or the Wish spell when we get high enough. For now, in our day-to-day, the average encounter, we can pull all the shenanigans we've been doing up to now, denying attacks, preventing enemies from reaching us, and protecting our allies. Again, if we're using Armor of Agathis, and assuming we get 3 hits before it runs out, we're going to deal 35.9 damage per round. And that, at level 17, is taking up 23.7% of the combat space. This is still average damage. For control, we're about the same. I'm not counting our Force Cage here, But with our other stuff, we're going to do the same. We're just going to be able to do it more often when the need arises. So we're at 60 CPR still at level 17. This is equivalent to using a wall of force. We're hitting that without even using concentration. And we're only using levels 1, 2, and maybe 3 spell slots. So I'd say that's pretty good. For our durability, at level 17, monsters are hitting pretty hard. And we're taking 116 damage per round. And now that only lasts us 1.5 rounds. If we were to summarize our characters' careers and the points that we've looked at, levels 5, 9, 13, and 17, we can say that the average combat space we take up is 19%. This is in the low damage category, but it's at the very top of it, so we're close to average damage. For control, we have on average 50.8 CPR, and I know that number probably means nothing to people, but here I'm going to put it on this line, and you'll see the difference between a really strong control and no control, and we land here. For durability, if everybody's attacking us, we can last for 1.45 rounds before dropping. So if we're totally surrounded and taking a beatdown, we can focus on our pure defensive abilities instead of control. We can do things like dodge, shield, absorb elements, or even blade ward. These all would help our survivability a lot if we are getting targeted. We also have a lot of ways of just preventing enemies from targeting us, obviously, as we've seen. Here's a diagram of our build's capabilities and the 3 axes of combat: damage, control, and durability. We can see this triangle here represents what our character has reached on each of these axes and where they may specialize. We are still weak against a couple things. Flying enemies, that's a huge one. There's not a lot that we can do here. We can use Vortex Warp to pull them down to the ground so we are all in melee. We can use Eldritch Blast to hit them from range and deal a little bit of damage. We could take some spells like Web or Earthbind. These will use our concentration. So if we bring them to the ground with these, our usefulness in combat is going to decrease a lot because we're not going to use our ready action to do spells anymore. Also against ranged characters, our Armor of Agathis is not going to come into play because it needs to be a melee attack. So this becomes a weakness for us as well. It'll be good for us if our allies can take them out quickly, and we can easily facilitate that by teleporting our allies over there or bringing them right to us. Here is what I think are the cool parts of our character and what really makes it shine. I think our playstyle and our abilities make it really interesting to run in combat. We're going to be analyzing the combat field in a way we normally don't do, and we're going to be able to move people, manipulate the battlefield, and grant attacks. Our allies, hopefully, will really love us. We would play really well with a team of ranged people or skirmishers. This would be great for maximizing our abilities, for reducing enemies' movement, and preventing them from reaching our allies. The most unique part of this build that I'm hoping is going to come into play a lot is by removing the enemy's target during their movement. I showed in that example that if the enemy's moving towards our ally and we cast Levitate on them, that enemy then has to move towards a different target, but they're no longer in reach, so they have to dash. I don't think this is something that can be replicated on other builds because it's dependent on us interrupting their movement. If we had used our action to levitate our ally before the enemy's turn, that enemy would then be able to reach another target and they'd hit them. By interrupting their movement and making them reach an ally first, and then removing their target, they then have to move that distance twice, and that's something I think would be really cool to see. I hope this is not going to cause conflict with your DM. Yes, you're the Chessmaster, but I hope your DM doesn't feel like they're playing chess against you, and they need to beat you. I hope they recognize that not having access to concentration spells is severely limiting your control options, and so having this kind of ability is a way to make up for that. We've all seen lots of builds that use hypnotic pattern to deny enemies their attacks. It's very powerful and it's very useful. This we're going to use a different way to deny our enemies attacks, and it's going to consume more resources. But I think it'll be fun. For a lot of our abilities, we can do similar things without using our ready action each turn. So if you want to take these ideas and put them into your build without forcing yourself to lose concentration each turn, I would understand. For us, we're going to keep it a little unoptimized. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you have a great day.